Hey friends, today we're going to talk about graphing trig functions by hand. So let's start with this trig function. We've got y equals 2 cosine 4x plus 1. And the question we're going to start with is, what is the period of this function? So we can pull out pretty easily the three key features that are in our equation. We've got the amplitude, the frequency, and we've got the midline. Um, which of those three key features are we going to use to find the period? We're going to use the frequency because period equals 2 pi divided by the frequency. And we've got a frequency of 4, so the period is going to be 2 pi over 4. 2 and 4 have a common factor of 2, so we can simplify that. And get that the period is pi over 2. What does that mean visually? Well, on our graph, it means that one cycle of our pattern is going to take us from 0 to pi over 2. So let's start to graph this by hand. And we're going to start with the midline is going to be at 1. So I'm just going to draw in a dotted line as the midline. My cats are, as always, going absolutely crazy in the background. That's where I know my midline is going to be. But this is a cosine graph. It doesn't start on the midline. Where is it going to cross the y-axis? It's going to cross at the maximum, so I need to find the maximum. And luckily, I also know the amplitude, right? I've got an amplitude of 2, so I know that my midline is going to be up 2, or my maximum is going to be up 2 from the midline. So I'm going to have a maximum here, and that's where I'm going to start. And then I'm going to go through my entire cosine pattern, and I know that one cycle of that pattern, one period, is going to take me to pi over 2. So I know that it's going to start here, and it's going to end here at pi over 2. So now it's just going to be, let's get in some of these points. It starts at pi over 2, and it ends at pi over 2. And in between, it's got to hit the maximum, or the midline, the minimum, the midline again, and the maximum. And luckily, it follows this very clear pattern every time. We're exactly halfway between these two maximums. So that halfway point, we're going to hit a minimum of, let's see, we're at a midline of 1, we go down 2 to find our minimum. So at -1, I'm going to have a minimum, and I'm going to hit it exactly between my two maximums. And then exactly between those 2 points, I'm going to draw that in, exactly between those 2 points, that's where I'm going to hit my midline. So I'm going to hit the midline there and there. And that's going to be the shape of my cosine graph. And it's going to be like that. So that's a lot of extra mess on this graph, right? But what did we really do to graph this accurately? We were able to find 5 accurate points in a cycle. And that's what you need to do anytime that you are asked to graph. That's my cat jumping on and off of the door, sorry. You need to find those 5 accurate points anytime that you graph a trig function. And we can do it again for the next cycle. This is still going to be pi over 2, or a period of pi over 2. So from half a pi to a full pi, that's going to be our next cycle. Is going to go in there. And we're going to go from maximum to maximum. Exactly halfway in between, we're going to hit the minimum. Exactly halfway in between these 2 points, we're going to hit our midline. And exactly halfway between these 2 points, we're going to hit the midline. And we've got 5 accurate points to draw a graph the next cycle. of our trig function. And we could keep going like that all the way to 2 pi. And we got this very accurate graph, although admittedly less beautiful because of my handwriting as I try to write on a touch screen. So steps. When you're sketching a trig graph, you are going to start by drawing in the midline. Create the minimum and maximum boundaries based on the amplitude. So figure out where your minimum and maximum will be. And if it's easier for you, you can draw those in as a dotted line too. You can just kind of have a road here that your graph is going to be going down. Figure out the starting point. Remember that sine starts on the midline and cosine starts at the max or min. And then figure out the frequency and period. And really, I think it's much easier to graph your trig function if you know the period rather than just the frequency, and you can use that equation, period equals 2 pi over frequency. And then you're going to draw in your starting and stopping points, and you're basically going to divide your graph into 4 sections in order to get all of those points on accurately. So let's do it one more time. And if you have a piece of scrap paper or a piece of graphing paper, I realize that I can't give you something as nice as this to graph on, but take a moment and see if you can graph it on your own before watching the rest of this video. So I have a midline of 1. I have an amplitude of 4. I have a frequency of 2, and I know I have a sine function, which means that I'm starting at the midline, and it is a positive sine function, so it's going to start at the midline and go up to the max. So I know that in a little bit I'm going to want to know my period. So let's find that. Period equals 2 pi over frequency. The frequency is 2. So our period is just going to be pi because those 2's will cancel. So we've got a period of pi. Okay, let's start filling this in. Start with the midline. We've got a midline at 1. I'm going to draw it as a dotted line. And then I've got a maximum of, let's see, 1 plus an amplitude of 4 is going to bring me up to 5. So my maximum is up here. And then the minimum is going to be that one, and then down 4, minimum is going to be at -3. And then my period is pi, so I'm going to just draw in a line at pi. And now I've got basically a box that my period of this trig function is going to have to happen in. So since it's sine, it's going to start at the midline. Let's get these 5 accurate points that we need to have. We're starting our cycle at the midline, and we're ending our cycle at the midline. And think about what a sine graph looks like. It starts at the midline, goes up, down, back to the midline. So that's the pattern we're drawing, as opposed to when we graphed cosine and it started at the maximum, went down to the minimum, and came back to the maximum. We're going to have this sort of SE thing. So halfway between where it starts and where it stops, we're back at the midline. So halfway in between this point and this point, we're going to be back at the midline. And then halfway between here and here, halfway between those first 2 times we cross the midline, we're going to be at the maximum. So I'm going to go to the halfway point. I'm going to put in a dot at the maximum. And then halfway between the midline, these 2 times, we go down to the minimum. So I'm going to go to this halfway point and go down to the minimum. So those are my 5 points of accuracy, and I'm going to connect them to make my trig function. And if we were doing this by hand on paper, I'd want us to be a lot neater sketching it in than this, but this is just the best I can do on a touch screen, sorry. And then our cycle is going to take up another pi and repeat from pi to 2 pi, so we can do the same thing. Midline, 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 maximum, minimum, and we've sketched our sine graph. All right, guys, you have a Delta Math 13 where you're going to practice drawing trig graphs. I'm going to do one Delta Math with you quickly because I think the formatting is a little bit of a pain to figure out on your own. So if we look at this Delta Math problem, it says on the axes below, make an appropriate scale and graph exactly one cycle of the trig function y equals 8 sine 2x minus 8. So the first thing it asks you to do is set the x and y axis labels. And to me, the easiest x-axis label, as long as we're setting it ourselves, is just going to be to have the x-axis label be the period of the graph. So let's figure that out. We've got a frequency here of 2, so period equals 2 pi over frequency. So 2 pi over 2, the 2's cancel, we're going to have a period of pi. So let's just make the x-axis label pi. And then y-axis, this graph is going pretty high because we've got a midline of -8, or not high, but like spread out. We've got a midline at -8, and then we've got an amplitude of 8, which means that our maximum is going to be 8 up from -8 is going to be to 0, and then our minimum is going to be -8 minus 8 is going to be all the way down at -16. So let's set a y step of 4 so that we can make sure we get -16 onto this graph, and done. Okay, so now it says move the x-axis scale in place and plot 5 points for one cycle. So what we mean by move it in place is we've got this pi that we said that was one period. Let's move it to where we want it. And we know we're going to end up dividing our graph into 4 sections. I'm going to move it 8 squares over and let each section be 2 squares. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So that goes there. And then let's just start plotting these 5 points. We're going to start at our midline, which is -8, because this is a sine function. So I'm going to start at the midline of 8, and I know that when I get to the end of my cycle at pi at the end of the period, I'm going to be back at the midline. And then I know exactly halfway in between, 1, 2, 3, 4 squares over, where am I going to be? I'm going to be back at the midline. So then in between these first 2 times we hit the midline, we're going to be up at the maximum, which we said was 0. I'm going to put it there. And then in between these 2 midline hits, we're going to be at the minimum, which is -16. And that is one cycle of our trigonometric function, which is all they asked for. And how'd we do, guys? Bam, we nailed it. All right, so that's what you're doing for your Delta Math assignment. And this is it for this week. Definitely come to office hours if you have any questions. We miss you and love you. See you soon.